Thank you so much for coming out tonight as we continue our Spring Meet the Author series. My name is Erin Shea, and I'm the head of adult programming here at the library. I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign, so thank you for your continued support to make programs like these and our collections available to the community. Tonight's guest is the youngest child of Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, the famous aviators. Our speaker grew up with her sister and three brothers right here in Darien, Connecticut. She attended Radcliffe College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then moved to Vermont, which is where she currently resides. She's the author of two family memoirs, No More Words and Under a Wing, two novels, Moving to the Country and The Names of the Mountains. She also wrote View from the Air, a poem presenting Charles Lindbergh's love of earth and sky. It is illustrated by photographs taken on her father's last flights as a pilot by photographer Richard W. Brown. Honorary chairman of the Charles A. and Anne Morrow Lindbergh Foundation since 2004, she has served as president since 1995, vice president since 1986, and has been a member of the board of directors since the foundation's formation in 1977. In this work, she leads efforts to further her parents' vision for improving the quality of life through balance between nature and technology. And as you may know, Darien Library is a Gold LEED certified building, and we also love technology, so Darien Library really appreciates that. She has come back to Darien this evening to discuss Against Wind and Tide, the letters and journals of her late mother, Anne Morrow. A collection of first-hand accounts from 1947 to 1986, Against Wind and Tide gives us a rare glimpse into the personal thoughts of a wife, a mother, and prolific writer during the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming to Darien Library, Ms. Reeve Lindbergh.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, especially because I left with my friend Carol Hyman, who's parking the car and checking other things out. We left New York at 4, and we decided to take the Merrick because it's so pretty. And it just never moved. It just crept along, and we kept saying, but it's really pretty, and pretty soon it's going to open out and go faster, and it never did. So we got to about Greenwich. We got to Greenwich, and I said, I bet if we get off at Lake Avenue, I can find our way to Route 95, I-95. So we did that, and I went down past what used to be Rosemary Hall, where I went to high school, and we were feeling really great about it. And we got to 95, and so we didn't get on it. We turned around, and I have an iPhone I was trying to figure out, which I can barely use. I was trying to figure out how to get to Route 1 from where I was, and it said, nothing found. I wasn't asking it the right questions, and I don't know how to talk to the person who talks back to you from the phone. So it was just insane. But we finally bisected Route 1, and then we just kept coming in. And I was making frantic phone calls to Erin and telling her, I didn't know if if ever we'll get there. Because but we did. We just got here. I'm so excited. And yes, this is where I grew up, and came to the library, which was not right here, but in the earlier building. Loved it, but this is fantastic. What a treat, and what a joy it must be for the kids in town to come and be at this building and do all the things, all the wonderful things they can do that I have to call my grandson to teach me. Anyway, I'm excited and a little giddy to be right here in Darien again, and I can see a number of friends in this group, and I'm thrilled. And what I'm going to do is to share a little bit of this book with you. The book, Against Wind and Tide, is the last of the series of diaries and letters that our mother started herself at, it was actually right around the time my father became ill and eventually died in the early 1970s, and she wanted to put together her memories from their time together, and he was very, very supportive of this project. She started her diary in that time. She started the diary when she was in 1922, when she was quite young and going to school, and she finished the last of those 5 books just at the end of the Second World War, about 1945, right about the time I was born. And then she stopped collecting that material. And she did a few things after that time that my father died, but I think it was harder for her to put together the way that she had done, to put together a book. They had always worked together. They had an extraordinary partnership over 45 years, rather a complicated and unexpected partnership, and they were tremendously supportive of one another's work. And I think the lack of that half of the partnership in writing and literature very much impeded her being able to finish what she wanted to toward the end of her life. She really said she wanted to write a gift from the sea for old age, which was a lovely idea. And she wrote some wonderful things about aging, and she did do some speeches and had some material that she thought she might draw together for a book. She also did some very touching work on widowhood after my father died. She did a lovely talk at the Cosmopolitan Club, Women's Club in New York City, and it was about the stages that she recognized in her own life as she moved forward and moved on, and she called it musical chairs because she said that it felt as though life was a series of kind of times when you moved and times when you stopped. You know, the music stopped, and you kind of took stock of where you were. And you go, the music goes on and on and on, and suddenly it stops, and you're a young mother. And then it starts again and goes on and on and on, and the children have left home. And then it starts and goes on, and my golly, you're 75, and you're thinking, now what? So she wrote and delivered a lovely speech about that. But it starts here in 1947, just after the war, with quite a conflict in her life. And when she becomes pregnant for the 7th time, feels that she cannot have another child, thinks about having an abortion, knows that she doesn't really believe in abortion, is very much torn between her sense of herself as a mother and her sense of herself as a woman who has work to finish, and also a woman who doesn't feel very well. As it turned out, she had a miscarriage, and that issue kind of became moot. But meanwhile, she thought quite a bit and continued to think quite a bit about how difficult it was and how interesting to try to be completely a mother and completely a writer. And she often quoted Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had said in a letter to her sister, had said that writing is rowing against wind and tide, writing under those circumstances. What I did was to look up the original letter from Harriet Beecher Stowe to her sister, and I found that it reminded me a great deal of the way my mother was about her own writing. Because this is a woman who wrote every day of her life, one way or another. She was writing letters to friends and relatives. She was writing in her diary. She was taking note of her thoughts. She was putting together ideas one way or the other. And she wrote constantly, and she was always saying, I'm not writing. I'm not writing enough. I'm not writing well. I'm not... Somehow she had a sense that she was not writing. So first, let me read to you what Harriet Beecher Stowe said in this letter to her sister. She said, I am constantly pursued and haunted by the idea that I don't do anything. Since I began this note to you, I've been called off at least a dozen times. Once for the fish man to buy a codfish. Once to see a man who had brought me some barrels of apples. Once to see a bookman. Then to Mrs. Upham to see about a drawing I'd promised to make for her. Then to nurse the baby. Then into the kitchen to make a chowder for dinner. And now I am at it again, for nothing but deadly determination enables me ever to write. It is rowing against wind and tide. And my mother wrote always, believing that she wasn't getting anything done, much like Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I write in my introduction about this. When she traveled to Europe after the war and observed devastation in Germany, she wrote. When she felt deep conflict between her life as an artist and her life as a wife and mother, she wrote. When she spent an evening at the Kennedy White House, she wrote. When she learned of the death of a child or the death of a president, she wrote. She often wrote 3 or 4 long letters in one day, and yet in many of them she apologized for not writing soon enough, or often enough, or well enough. In her diaries, too, she often despaired of her inability to get enough writing done. One of the paradoxes of my mother's life was that she wrote constantly, always chastising herself in writing for not writing. This is true. She also worked with my father to preserve the archive, because many institutions had asked them if they would deposit letters and diaries and various manuscripts. My mother's manuscripts went to Smith. The letters and diaries went to Yale. And the way they went to Yale, obviously they didn't send the originals to Yale. They used carbon paper. Some of you will remember carbon paper. And my mother had, this is actually one of her pads, I found it. So there's the blue pad, and she would put 1 or 2 pieces of carbon paper between the sheaves of the paper, usually 2. So you'd have 1 copy would go to the addressee. 1 copy would be kept in my mother's files to remember what she had written, how the correspondence went. And 1 copy would go to the Yale archives. When I was looking for a carbon pad, I found 2 actually, because when she wrote letters to friends, she used the little ones like that. But they also had carbon paper. And I couldn't find an envelope to put all this stuff in. And then I found it wasn't tattered then, I found an envelope in the same drawer with the carbon paper. And when I opened up the envelope, there were all these brass paper clips. That was my father. Because he would never use anything but brass paper clips because he didn't want anything to rust. He didn't want the archives to rust. So he had, my sister and I used to make necklaces of the brass paper clips. Because they were beautiful and you know, they were lovely, and we thought it was very funny that he would only use brass paper clips. But all I had to do was open that envelope, and I thought nobody but my father would have just lined them up like that. And so that was the system which they used. And when my brother Land and I and my niece Christina, who would be my brother John's daughter, and our friend Carol Hyman, who has been driving me and organizing the project and wrangling Lindbergh, she's pretty good at that. And the 4 of us got together at Yale at the archives, and we visited 3 or 4 times, maybe for 3 days at a time, and we all went through the material. We found we actually copied, transcribed about 3,000 pages of material to begin with. It was voluminous, the material. Of course, we're talking 40 years. Then we fought over. We each took home the transcribed material, and we decided which pieces absolutely had to stay. So and there were 4 of us. So it often overlapped, but not always. And we finally got it down to about 1,000 pages. And then we went through it again, and we decided that some of it was redundant. She might have written several letters to somebody while she was reading the work of the Scottish philosopher John McMurray, for instance. She tended to write about what she was reading, and we would decide that we just would keep 1 letter about McMurray. So we got it down to about 600 pages, and then we sent it proudly to the editor, a wonderful woman called Altie Carper at Random House, Pantheon. And Altie said, "It's lovely, but it needs to go down another 200 pages." So we tore our hair, and we met in Vermont for yet one more weekend and went through it page by page. And finally, by golly, here it is. It's 339 pages, and including my introduction. And we are delighted that it's here. So I'm going to read you a little bit of it, little bits and pieces from what my mother had to say. Here and there. Let's see. see if I can find. I'm going to find something about her children. Yes, here we go. There's a section just before it where she's talking about her reading. She said, I've been reading a very good novel and also an article by Jung, The Fight with the Shadow. Very exciting, the price of unconsciousness in the world and in individuals. Perhaps the mind is not dead, but working in new channels. So she'll write a sentence like that. And then she has a diary entry. We have had 3 appalling weeks, the kind one hardly believes while one is going through it, and afterwards, as now, it seems quite unbelievable, except for the inexplicable weariness. Written down, it sounds merely funny. John came down with whooping cough. When Land started his cough a few days later, we assumed it was the early stages of whooping cough. He sleeps in the same room. We watched him go through the same stages of fever, cough, etc. At the end of a week, I realized to my horror one evening, looking at him, that Land was coming down with the measles. Dr. Shoup, I don't know if anybody remembers Dr. Shoup. Dr. Shoup came down the next morning. Dr. Shoup would come from Westport, and he would make house calls, and we loved him. Except for the shots. I didn't like shots. Okay, so Land was coming down with measles. Dr. Shoup came down the next morning and confirmed it, but he said not to worry about John, as it was very rare to have 2 contagious diseases at once. Then, after saying this, he crossed over, looked into John's throat, and said, well, he already has it. And from the coughing, he guessed Land had whooping cough, too. There followed a week of trays, making beds, taking temperatures, alcohol rubs, reading, carrying drinks, emptying basins, washing, etc. I felt so tired from running up and down stairs. After a week of this, when Land's spots had melted and his temperature down, we let him get up one day. The next day, he came down with mumps. This is true. He's the only person I know who had measles, whooping cough, and mumps at the same time. And then the little ones were starting. Scott and Anne were coughing, Reeve with the fevers, and so on and so on. And she said, I read Mary Poppins. That's what she did for us. For me, anyway. I loved it. And distributed presents. She did that. And rubbed backs with witch hazel. And washed out slop buckets. And gave medicine and ran up and down stairs and dropped into bed at night, too tired to think. Then, the very next entry, she's outside Lexington, Virginia, with my father. She's been scooped up out of all this turmoil. She says, I've been 5 weeks in the trailer with Charles touring the West. Arizona, Utah, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and then across the South. A very strange and lovely life, pure with no distractions, I bet. A very simple day-to-day life. Housekeeping in this tidy, compact little room. Now that was a trailer, I remember it very well. It was a black trailer with silver on the top and on the bottom, sort of silver, looked like duct tape, but I don't think it was. And we would travel in this trailer that was wooden on the inside, sort of like a nice boat. And it was given to my father after the Second World War when he had been a consultant for Henry Ford in building bombers at Dearborn, Michigan. And my mother lived there, and some of us were born, some not me. But after that time, he was given this gift, and the family used it for years. When my father would hook up, every so often, he would hook up the trailer to the old ranch wagon, and he would take us to Florida, which was like heaven. He took us out of school into Florida. It was wonderful. And then he also took my mother. When he wanted her to take off and go off with him, they would go with the trailer. And yet they were great adventures. She said it was a little bit like the early flights we used to take, which of course meant when she and my father were charting the air routes, the first air routes for TWA, TAT, and they were 26 and 29, and they went in this little Lockheed Sirius seaplane, and went up over the North Pole to Asia, just the 2 of them. She was his co-pilot, navigator, communicator. She learned Morse code and became a pilot, and of course he was the chief pilot. And there was always adventure. Her early books about that time are really fun to read, but I would be so terrified if my children were doing that. And there they were. So she said, it's not so different from the big trips we used to take, not as arduous as the flights or so dangerous. This was playing at something, not a life and death contest, and yet there was that same quality of adventure that Charles puts into anything he does. This business of taking an overloaded trailer, lurching over rocky cattle tracks, or slithering down gullies over mountain passes, we pay for this adventurousness in tires, leaky radiator, broken clutch, and general wear and tear. How many times has Charles jacked us out of a position his adventurousness got us into? Mud, sand, a ditch we got stuck in. Our tires are gone with rock bruises. How many times have I climbed out, jammed rocks or blocks under the car or the trailer to get out of a tough place? Going over the pass at Cloudcroft, we unpacked 500 pounds of equipment. I sat on it while Charles took the trailer over the hump and came back for me in the load. So, she says, these adventures have not meant danger. They've at worst meant discomfort, delay, a lot of hot work for Charles. He always manages to get out of the fixes he gets into. Actually, these didn't seem like ordeals to me, but like adventures. The difficulties for me, curiously enough, lie in what is most ordinary for all the other women in the world. Keeping house, shopping, cooking, ordinary living. I'm very stupid at it because I've never really done it. I've never shopped and cooked and cleaned for my husband like an ordinary woman. When most women learn this, when they're first married, I was learning to fly and to operate a radio and to navigate and fly a glider. So I don't know a good cut of meat from a poor one or what things cost by the pound. I know about how much 13 people eat in a month. But I'm learning, and I'm glad to learn such simple things. And she goes on and on about that. There's a lot about what she can't do, and not quite so much about what she can do, but she did quite a bit. And when I think about the 5 of us coughing and having the mumps and all those things, and we always felt it was that our interests, of course, must be, paramount for her. So, we could call her and say, Mother, where are you? And she would just have been with one, and she'd come down and take care of the other. She talks a little, she has a lovely series of letters to my father when she was flying back from Florida or from other areas. She did some work in Europe after the war for Reader's Digest. So there were a lot of letters to him, and certainly in this early part. And she says, let's see, no, that's not the one I want. Oh, flying always makes me think of you and our life together. What worlds you have opened up to me. The world of the air, the world of practical life, even the underwater world. And I'm always timid about new worlds. I must learn to go into new worlds on my own. And that, I think, is interesting because she did go into new worlds on her own, but it was really the introspective, what I think of as her world was inner space, and she learned to explore that world greatly. Now, she also did what she called an annotated wedding vow. 20 years after on her 20th wedding anniversary, she decided that she had read over her wedding vows, and she decided they were very beautiful and moving, but they needed to be changed. So this is what she calls marriage vows annotated after 20 years. It starts like this. I, a most imperfect person, take you, also imperfect, to be my husband in that most imperfect but also most challenging and rewarding of all relationships, marriage. Since I know you are not perfect, I do not worship you. I've learned that worship of another human being is only a form of shirking one's responsibility, a shifting of the burden to another's shoulders. I cannot accomplish this difficult task, but you, O superior being, can do it all. Worship, I believe, is a burden too great for the human frame to bear, and in the end is degrading to both the worshiper and the worshipped. On this earth, one is permitted only to worship God. I do not promise to obey you. Not that I do not long with all of a woman's traditional desire to serve you hand and foot, but I know that this very natural desire to find myself a master is actually selfish and will not serve you. I would not debase you by assuming that you want a slave. I do not promise to love you. Of course, I do love you. But to promise to feel this way exactly, always, would be like promising never to grow a gray hair. I have many already. I do not look on marriage as a solution to any of my problems. I know that marriage will be a mirror for them, and my imperfections will show up under that naked light, but I will try not to be ashamed to have you see them. I do not promise to live up to any idealized image you may have of me. Please do not put me on a pedestal. Being adored is close to being despised. It is the reverse side of the same coin, and one is apt to follow the other. Neither will I ask you to live up to an idealized image. And then she says something that I think is quite wonderful for the two of them. She says, I do not expect marriage to fill my essential loneliness, nor do I hope to fill yours, having learned that everyone is, in the last analysis, alone, and believing this is not something to grieve about, but to rejoice in. Rather, I promise to respect and protect your aloneness, knowing that everything created must have its period of darkness, child and bulb, poem and personality. I promise not to pry into your loneliness, never to tear at the bud with frightened fingers to make sure there's a flower there. I believe in the flower. And that, I think, was a really essential part of their relationship, was that they protected whatever the other essentially was. They protected it, believed in it, tried not to interfere in it too much, although my father was definitely the organizer, sort of military. He ran the house when he was home, and we snapped to, and we did what he said, and we would be called into his office, and he would have a list for each of us. I've written about this before. He'd have a list for each of us with our various obligations, our sins, our things that he needed to talk to us about. And I used to come in, and he would be sitting at his desk, and I would be in the doorway, and he would have the list in front of him. And I could see whoever had been before me, the things were checked off. And I'd look on my list, and if it was a short one, and it just had things like skates left out in rain, and then courtesy to Mother or something. It was pretty courteous to Mother, but there would be a few things on it. Then I thought, okay, this is going to be short. But if it had things like freedom and responsibility, I knew I was in for a long time. And that was what he would do. He would come in, he would call us in, he would kind of check off our minor offenses, and then he would give us a lecture on something huge. And, all right. So she went through the years with all these children, and some of it was ski trips and measles and all kinds of adventures for all of us. And then some of us left the home, and she would reach out to us through letters. There's a lovely one to John, who had just he had been. I guess he was at Stanford, and there was a young man who was a classmate or a roommate, and had written an article for the Herald Tribune about John, which was kind of a surprise. And my mother was very indignant, and she says, "Dearest John, my first reaction to the Herald Tribune announcement that a schoolmate of yours had written an article about you was, what a dirty trick. I still feel that way after having read the article, even though the article is what is called favorable and seems to have been written with the best of intentions, reasonable accuracy, and some degree of taste, not to speak of obvious admiration. Very few people realize that any publicity is bad." That's an interesting statement from the 21st century point of view, because mostly they say all publicity is good. So it makes one's life more difficult, more artificial, less natural. It insulates us from normal life and relations with other people. I once told your father that to be famous was like having Medusa's head. Life was arrested and turned to stone around you. People stopped being themselves. He said it was like having the Midas touch. And she goes on at some length, and is very, very supportive and positive with John. But she's giving him the benefit of her feeling about what has just happened to him, and her sense of how you get through it and how you manage. Then there's a piece that she writes really in her diary, just to herself, after my father's book, The Spirit of St. Louis, has been published and has been received with great acclaim. And she finds herself feeling pangs of jealousy. And she takes herself to task for this. But she also lets herself go and talk about what it is that she feels about it. She says, "I'm ashamed of these emotions, and when I can be quiet and think out why they're there, they vanish. But sometimes they catch me unawares. I'm too much of a writer not to recognize this book as an epic. It is a great moment in history, greatly told by a man of greatness. I also know that he would not have told it, could not have told it that way if he had not married me. 20 years of living with me have gone into the book before the man who said to me when we were engaged, "You like to write books?" Astonished and curiously condescending, "I like to live them." Before that man absorbed my values about the written word from my books, both those I wrote and those I read, my education, my way of talking, my way of writing, my admiration of writers, before he had absorbed all this to such a degree that he has put it back in this epic of a book. The difference between We, that was his first book that he wrote when he was 25, right after the flight, and it's actually a great book. It's written because you could feel it was written by a 25-year-old. It's very fresh and very full of adventure, and he could not have written it at any other time, I think. I think it was just right in full flush of having survived that. And anyway, I love that book. But she says the difference between We and The Spirit of St. Louis, which of course was written over a period of almost 20 years, is my impact on Charles and life's, but life with me, as observer, as critic, as commentator. What I did on the book, cutting, transposing, criticizing, telling him where to end, where to point up, where to synchronize, and tone. Little bits and that, bits of this and that, checking and rechecking everyone else's corrections. Was that valid or not? At least 10 people did an overhaul on it. All of this work, although it added to the perfection of the book, wasn't as important as those 20 years of living with me. Slowly, she's absolutely right. It's absolutely true. Slowly changing and opening, sharpening his perceptions, his articulateness, his aesthetic, and spiritual sensitivity. And so then she says she's very proud of it, but there's too much pain. And then she goes on for some time about all these emotions. And this is what I mean by the inner space, the exploration. She's looking at what she feels, and she's wondering what it means. And she says, jealousy is the unlived life in you crying out to be spent. This I believe to be deeply true in this situation. Charles has written his book, and she says how much she would like to write hers. He's written his book, I've never written mine. And then she goes on and she writes her book, and he was actually right there. He was gone a great deal of the time, but he was right there helping with the galleys and the publicity and the pulling it all together. They didn't do publicity in this sense. You never saw my parents at a book signing. I don't think either one of them was ever at such an event. They sold thousands of books. They didn't have to go to book signings, but they felt very exposed in large public occasions. He more than she. I mean, she was a diplomat's daughter, and she was able, though very shy, to kind of rise to those occasions, literally. But on they go. She writes about John's wedding. She writes about and the birth of his first daughter, Christina, who in fact was one of the 4 editors for this book. She writes about the children growing up and her mother dying. There's quite a bit about grief in this book at different periods. And then she comes to a time when her daughter Anne, my older sister, is married and in France. Her first husband was French, and they decided to have a wedding at a little place not in the very south of France, but in the Dordogne. And my mother is trying to persuade my sister that she should persuade my father to go to the wedding, because he didn't go to public occasions, and there were many weddings he didn't go to in the family. But she says, I think unless you've done it already, you should write him a letter and tell him exactly what the wedding will be and urge him to be there. I've already told him I don't think there will have to be any wedding in our sense of the word. Tell him he doesn't have to give you away as fathers do in U.S. weddings. No minister, no church, no aisle, no white wedding dress and veil, etc. Just going to the mayor's office, and then a small reception with the family. Just the same, he said he didn't know whether he'd be there or not. He said he'd like to come and see you and Julien and the family, but he wasn't sure he'd be there for the ceremony. try to write him what it'll be like, and that he doesn't have to stand around all the time and meet a lot of people. Perhaps he could be there for the most private part. So she's trying to tell my sister that she has the power to bring my father to the wedding. And also, to my mind, she's protecting my father from the perhaps hurt and indignation of the daughter, who might be really annoyed that her father wasn't planning to come to her wedding. It was a masterful letter. And my sister then did write him, and my mother writes again, "Darling, you wrote a beautiful letter to your father. He was pleased and said it was lovely and very thoughtful and considerate. He did not give me his verdict, but my prognosis is good." And he came. He did come, but he was very, very, very unhappy in any kind of large crowd. I mean, unless he was with a group of Air Force gentlemen, generals and others. For instance, choosing the military base at the Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, he could be with hundreds of his colleagues and his natural group. But what he thought of as kind of cocktail parties or large, even going to church, large groups, it was very, very difficult for him. He did mellow quite a bit. They went to the Kennedy White House for a dinner and actually liked it very much. They especially liked the way the Kennedys were with their children. And my mother wrote to Mrs. Kennedy about that, about how wonderful it was that somebody at that level in America was able to raise their children so well. And that, I think, was something that we all felt about the Kennedys. She writes to my brother Land when he decides he wants to be in the West and he wants to raise cattle, which he has done. And she said, "I can see why you love the West and want a ranch. It's a beautiful country where you are. One has a sense of space and wilderness and animals and also somehow of time. We felt very far away from New York and the overcrowded East. I love the sense of the mountains and the elk who didn't run away. Your father," I guess they saw an elk and the elk just stood there. "Your father had a marvelous time and it was something for me to watch him. I've never seen him on a ranch or a farm. He falls into it like a duck into water. I never realized how deeply ingrained in it he was." And that's true, of course. He grew up in Minnesota. A great deal of his time was spent on a farm in northern Minnesota. And he loved it that we all ended up living, most of us ended up living in the country. There, inevitably, we go further along, and my father is very ill. Well, before that, wait a minute. I've got something I wanted to read you, because at a certain point, with all that was going on with her children and then grandchildren and all of the rest, she stopped really wanting to go and take those trips. She would do it occasionally. He would scoop her up and take her to Africa for a few weeks, and she actually loved that. That was a conservation trip. And they went to Japan once, later in the 60s. And she occasionally would just balk and say, "Nope, I'm not going." And this time it was because my father, who had been in the Philippines working with conservation and with native tribes, and he had dealings with President and Mrs. Marcos, and he decided that it would be wonderful if my mother would join him. So he called her from Hong Kong, and she wrote, "Dear Charles, it was certainly startling to have a call from Hong Kong, and even more startling to have you propose, saying it was practically a presidential order, my going to the Philippines this May." It was this May, wasn't it? You weren't by any chance talking about next May. As you gathered, I feel it is next to impossible to go, certainly horribly difficult and inconvenient. I would like to go with you to the Philippines sometime. I'd like to meet President and Mrs. Marcos and Manuel Elizalde, who was a government official who was working with native tribes there. Also, simply from what you've told me about it, I'd like to see the native tribes, and I know that's an experience that can't wait too long, either from their point of view or mine. The older I get, the harder it may be to do physically. I am so, this is the most important, so touched that you want me to come, that you want to show me a new part of the world and to open up to me, as you have many times before, a totally new experience. I am grateful for this deep down underneath, even though I object, complain, hold back, etc. So you see, I'd be coming for you, not on a presidential order. It's not my president anyway. And then she says, but really it isn't easy, it isn't fair to change your plans overnight. You don't tell me ahead of time what your plans are, where you're going and how long you'll be away or when you'll be back, etc. I don't mind, actually. I know that's the way you live and must live. But I can't, on the other hand, sit around and wait for you and make no plans. I must go ahead and lead my life on the basis that you aren't here or that you are leading your own life unpredictably as far as I'm concerned. So I make my plans. And her plans are to go to France and be with my sister Anne when her baby is born. And she is not about to fly to the Philippines and miss that. So this is a different tone in the beginning. I found myself quite surprised by the early tone of her letters to my father when he was away, because she seemed so deferential. And she had told me in conversation over time, she said, well, when your father and I were first married, he was the knight and I was the page. And I followed him, I wanted to be like him, I wanted to do whatever he did. And then she said, and then you children came along and everything changed. And over time, you see that everything changed. And yet that they had this partnership, which fascinates me, because, of course, we learned about 10 years ago that he also had other relationships and other families in Europe. And I have now met all of those other families, I hope. They're actually quite wonderful people. The children are maybe 10 to 15 years younger than I am, and they have children. And I met one of their mothers who was lovely. She was much like many friends of my mother. It was interesting woman. But I also think that they all had some sense of this rather extraordinary and very restless man who traveled the world and never stopped very long anywhere. He probably was with us for the longest periods of time, but he really couldn't, I think, stay for very long. And that's hard to live with, but she did. And from it, I think there was a period when she considered leaving my father. I know there was, in fact, because she told me. She said that she decided that if things didn't weren't better by the time Reeve was 10, she would leave him. This she didn't tell me until I was grown up. And I asked her, I said, well, what happened? And she said, things got better. And I think some of that has to do with her own support. And some of it is her beginning to understand that she believed in her own, what she called her own loneliness, her own solitude, and she also believed in his. She believed that he was who he was. She wasn't going to change him, and she didn't want to leave him. Interesting. So we go further, and then my father became ill with melanoma. I'm sorry, that was my sister. He had lymphoma. And he died in Hawaii. And she wrote a long meditation about widowhood, the first year after death and onward. And some of this, I've had friends who have read this book, one cousin who lost her husband about 2 years ago, and other friends who have said how I wish I had had this when he first died, because it gave her a great deal to read this piece. And none of this, this is not the kind of thing that I would read you because it was funny or charming or because it gave me a sense of her strength. It is, it's very poignant. I mean, this is one of the places that made me cry. So there were several, but this is one of them because of course, grief is so very immediate, and it has so much to do with missing the things that you did together. And she talks about, well, I will read you a little bit. She says, I've been doing all the year-end jobs, the out-of-doors ones. These are the easiest to do, even the ones we did together. Draining the hoses, putting them away, potting the begonias for indoors, taking the geraniums inside, digging in the bedraggled chrysanthemums in pots by the door. There is a different kind of companionship doing these jobs, even alone, that is so different from desk work. However, when I had to go down to the bomb shelter, he built a bomb shelter in our house in Darien. And he said in these times that he felt it was important that we had such things, even though he figured most of us wouldn't last long enough to use the bomb shelter if there were a nuclear attack. But he built this bomb shelter, and there was water and there was food for so many days. And my mother, seeing the dryness and the excellent atmosphere down there, began to store wine in the bomb shelter. And so when you went down there, you would see the canned goods and the oxygen masks, and then you'd see these cases and cases of Pedro Domecq. And that's where. But she said she was shaken when she went down to the bomb shelter. His instructions were so precise, so detailed, but also which I had forgotten, so humorous. They have that kind of slightly sarcastic tone, poking fun at the dumb woman plumber, like his instructions on the pressure cooker. And she quotes him, "Note, if the above directions have been carried out exactly, all will be hunky-dory. But it is possible that if the 2 emergency switches at the head of the stairs are observed with thoughtfulness, certain disturbing questions will arise," etc., etc. He was having so much fun writing these instructions. So the memories are the memories of what was funny and the memories of things that were shared. It's very hard and quite lovely. So she goes on further, and then she gets older, and she talks about it in that talk that I mentioned to you, musical chairs. Tasks at the end of life sounded too negative, she says, and as I started to write, I thought of the game musical chairs, which seems to describe life in its different stages, and at my particular stage, if you are not there yet, you will be. So she goes on to what she minds at this time of life and what she considers to be a waste. She says one of the great wastes are, she says, perfectionism is a waste at this time in life. It's all right to be perfectionist in your special area, your skill, your art, your scholarship, even an important letter. But perfectionism in household tasks is a waste. I don't try to scrub all the black off the pots and pans, and I don't see dust anymore. She says, clutter is a waste. And she says, when I don't know where to file it, I put it into an envelope marked conscience. And she talks about my sister who had 2 cartons in her house, one marked love and the other marked money. She finds almost everything fits into one of those 2 categories. So at the end of the list of wastes, she says, is a big one that underlies many of the others, a hidden leak in the bottom of the barrel, and that is trying to live by other people's standards. She said, I remember an old aunt saying to me of cocktail parties, I no longer put things in my stomach to please other people. Should one put things in one's mind to please other people? Read books to please other people? Or go to parties to please other people? By the time one reaches a certain age, one should be able, as Anne Morrow said, to have the courage of one's peculiarities. So that's a fun one. Then we went through a very difficult period for me with, I had a little boy who had encephalitis, and then ended up with cerebral palsy and some real troubles. And we were working with him a great deal, and he seemed we had a wonderful physical therapist, and he seemed to be doing very well, much better. And then one night when I was here in Darien with my mother, he died. He just died in the night. And it was a terrible time. My mother was unbelievable, tremendously supportive, and sat with me, with him, right after he died, and said, don't call anybody, don't do anything, just sit. And we did, and that was a great gift to me. She also continued to be very, very closely in touch with me over that year. And for someone who had been through the very same thing, I was so moved and so helped by her ability to come and connect with her daughter, who had had the same thing happen. And I could understand her finding that difficult, and perhaps she did, but she never said that to me. So this is a year later. This is the last letter in the book. And she says, "Darling Reeve, I'll be thinking about you this long and difficult week. I won't try and call you, but I'm here if you want to call me. I am enclosing excerpts from The Sacred Pipe, Black Elk's account of the 7 rites of the Oglala Sioux." And she says further, "I know we fret that anniversaries mark distance, that time is bearing those we love and have lost farther away, but perhaps we have too linear a sense of time. Time is perhaps, as the old Mexicans felt, not a river running away, but an ocean around us in which we are steeped. Time, in the article about a Navajo craftswoman, surrounds her, as do her dwelling place, her family, her clan, her tribe, her habitat, her dances, her rituals. My love is around you." And that is my little mother. Anybody have questions or comments or thoughts? You're welcome to. Yeah.
Did your mother write everything in longhand, or did she type?
She wrote, and she very rarely typed, but when we, that's my friend Carol, who's the co-editor and Lindbergh wrangler, and so, but she calculated that we did. How many pages of longhand do you think we had?
Probably close to 6,000.
Yeah, because she and her son were involved in a lot of the transcribing. That we copied, and then we transcribed, and then it was down to 3. And yeah, but she was writing all the time, every day, and a lot of it was occasionally difficult to read her handwriting. I think sometimes it was difficult for her to read her handwriting, but she basically had a very finely trained hand at Chapin School, but she got a little more exuberant from time to time, so it was sometimes it was a job, but she always wrote longhand. Yeah. Yes?
Do you take after your mother or your father?
I don't know. I don't know. Little of each, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Anybody else? Any thoughts? Anything? Yeah. Oh, I know you. Hey, Elsie.
Yes, it's Elsie.
No, I know.
Explain, because your mother explained it to me, why she was going into this effort to narrate or put down what a woman did for her lifetime. And she said that she felt it was very important that people knew what somebody did in a whole
Yes.
continuum.
Well, that's exactly she asked why, because my mother did speak to Elsie about her sense that it was important to put down, to record what your life was, that it was, because it's wonderful to read. She's absolutely right. And she had intended to go further with the diaries, but I don't know that she knew exactly where she intended to go with them, or whether she wanted to simply use her own wisdom to create that book that she called A Gift from the Sea for Old Age. She seemed, I think, to want to record her life with my father very carefully and meticulously, as he had always done. I think that was a gift to him. I really do. And I remember her when she was interviewed about some of those early books, and she would say, "I've got all my sources." You know, when somebody interviewed her, she said, "I have all my weapons ready." I thought, oh no. But I think she felt that he had been, of course, under attack because of his position before the Second World War. And she wanted to say, oh no, he wasn't a Nazi, he wasn't a this, he wasn't a that. Here's who he was. But she always believed in him. She would have wished he had expressed himself differently on many occasions. But she wanted to present a picture that she felt was the accurate one. And afterwards, I don't know that she had that urge to continue after his death. In fact, I know she didn't do the photocopying and not photocopying, the carbon copying. After he died, that system kind of broke down. We didn't find as much of that material. Some, but not. It wasn't done quite as carefully and meticulously. Yeah. When my father died, he was 74, so she must have been 70. because he was born in '02 and she was born in '06. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
The journals, she's writing it all down, it's all at home, so it was just respected and private. Some of those things are gone.
The journals that she wrote, anything that was unpublished, she left it was at Yale University, and she asked that it not be available until 10 years following her death. And some of it, according to the archivist, is not supposed to be available, fully available, until 40 years following her death. We had access to everything. So, and I don't know what, how I understood. I was the literary executor, and my understanding was that it was all to be open 10 years afterwards. But we haven't figured that out yet. And people come and they ask to see them, and we say yes. We haven't said no.
So when she would finish a journal,
yep.
she sent it right up to you?
When she finished a journal, she also had carbon copies of journals. So she would have the actual journal she kept for quite a bit. And actually those, I think, a lot of those went to Smith. But there were photocopies at Yale. That's what we used. I mean, carbon copies, duplicates or triplicates or both were at the institution.
But you and your siblings, when you were a young woman and you were writing,
What?
you didn't have access to those journals when you were...
If we had asked her, she would have let us see them. Yeah, she had no difficulty with that, but I would never have asked. I don't think it didn't feel right. I can't imagine looking at her journals in that way. She caused to be published those ones that she wanted published, and she was very careful. I think there was a lot destroyed. I think that there were things that if she didn't want people to see them, she didn't make carbon copies, no matter what my father's theories were. And he also did not carbon copy everything because my half-sister in France found letters from him to her mother that he had obviously didn't have. There were no copies of Yale of those. But clearly the kind of the for posterity things were at Yale, and there were just volumes and volumes of them, and all the letters to the children. But there have to have been things that either were not copied or that were destroyed. She writes in this book about going through analysis and then choosing to destroy any written material about that process and a number of letters. Yeah.
When I was a lot younger, I read Bring Me a Unicorn.
Oh,
I fell
yes.
in love with your mom.
That's the first one. It's lovely.
When did you read that, and how did you respond to it?
Oh, I read it. I loved that book. I mean, I read it. Those were published in the '80s, so I was in my 40s, and I was thrilled with those books. Especially I loved the introductions. I thought she did a wonderful job of explaining where she was in her life, and she worked and worked and worked over those. Her work with the letters was done with her editor Helen Wolfe at Harcourt Brace. The whole previous 5 books were done with Harcourt. And those editors were gone, and we were close to the editor at Random House, and who had worked with Gift from the Sea and all the republishings. So we went to Random House for this. But that's a treat, that book. Because she's 16 or something when she first. Yeah, it's really a treat. Yes.
Do you still write letters to your kids, grandkids, or do you email?
Oh, I do it all. I do it all. I'm a terrible texter. I was trying to do that just coming here. I have just barely gotten an iPhone, and my son-in-law has taught me somewhat how to use it, but I think we're staying in New York, and Caroline, I think we're going to go to an Apple store and get tutored for a little while, because I can't call my son-in-law every time I can't make something work. So, but I also try to write. I don't keep carbons, and once in a while I make photocopies of letters if I want to think about it, and I want to think about the correspondence, but I don't do what she did. I don't know. I don't do it. Yeah.
How old were you when she wrote Gift from the Sea? Were you aware of it?
I was 10, and when that book was published, and I remember that she was away a lot, and sometimes my father would actually took the older kids down to visit. two of my brothers down there, and we also went to that part of Florida quite a bit. But during that period, he insisted that she just have that time, and so we didn't get to go knocking on her door and showing us our, bruises and telling her what was in our hearts, which we often did. She would never refuse. I mean, she would, if you knocked on that door, she would open it, even if she was in the middle of her writing time.
Did it take her to write it?
It took her a long time because she wrote little bits of it. She called it the shells, and she wrote little bits of it during periods of visiting to Captiva early in previous years. I would say 4 or 5 years. But she did the real job, maybe 53 or 54, I think. And then, of course, there's the correcting and the galleys and all that. So it's usually a good year from delivery to publication. Yes.
So do you think your mother, as a younger woman, when she was originally doing these triplicates, anticipated them being published or put into an archive?
Well, they were in an archive. I mean, she did. She always sent the triplicates, the duplicates or triplicates, to Yale, to the Sterling Library, where their papers are housed.
Right.
So, from the beginning of their time, as long as I knew her, from 1945 at least, and certainly their material from before that. But that was their system. I think that was the system that was established within their marriage, and that was what they chose to do. And they lived in Connecticut since, well, started right around the time I was born, a little bit earlier, so mid to late 40s they were there. And they liked Yale because it was close by, and my father, they both had ties there. But they also have materials that she has at Smith College. She has all her manuscripts are at Smith College, and a number of the diaries, the originals. And he has material at the, Missouri Historical Society and the University of Minnesota. So the early boyhood things are in Minnesota, and anything to do with the flight is at Missouri, except for the plane, which is, of course, in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. But and the Smithsonian also has a lot of my mother's material from the flights in the Sirius, which is also at Smithsonian. So there are records and clothing, and somebody told me a few years ago that they opened up a book that she had with her, and they found one little pressed flower, beautifully pressed flower that she had saved from one of those trips. So a lot of stuff.
We have time for 2 more questions.
2 more questions. Okay. Any question? Yes.
So I've read "Listen to the Wind" and "The North to the Orient."
Yes.
And what made her do that? I mean, I know she married your father, but to go from being a writer and a diplomat and taking off in these planes and charting routes and passing the notes back and forth.
I know. I know. Well, when people asked her, she says, "I was in love," as if to say, "What can I tell you?" She loved being vaulted into that other world. She loved escaping the world in which, what did she say? She said, "My whole beribboned childhood it was in that book, it was in Bring Me the Unicorn, has been smashed to ribbons, and I have to go." And she went. But I can't tell you the answer to that. I think that's, well, of course, Amelia Earhart was also a writer and a poet. I mean, it often goes together. There's a wonderful David McCullough article and talk, and maybe even almost a book among his published work about aviator writers and that tradition. And somehow they went together, especially at that time. I think that was a very romantic time. And the writing and the flying went together in a way that I'm not sure would happen at any other time. Yes, second one.
I know you went flying with your father.
Oh, yes.
And do you think the decisions you made were similar to the ones your mother made? You crash in Danbury or something?
I didn't crash. I was 7 years old. But the automatic choke malfunctioned,
okay.
And he had to put us down. And he said it was a forced landing. He said he always said that whenever anything happened, he said this was not a crash, it was a forced landing. It seems to me a crash is a forced landing. So, but he put us down in this little field, and they had to take the plane apart to get it out. But when I wrote about it, I wrote in one of my books about it, and I was talking about my memory of because I could remember looking at the back of his neck as he was doing all this stuff and getting the plane down. And I said, well, he did this and he did that, and he got the rudder and the flaps set. And then after I wrote the book and published it, a pilot came up to me at a book signing and said, Reeve, nobody will know this but pilots, but there are no flaps in that aircraft. So I had to tone it down a little bit, take it out. No, it was fun. It was very, very, very noisy. I remember that. It was just a cotton in our ears, and he didn't approve.
I had a way of thinking. I asked him how hard it was to learn how to fly.
Yes.
And he said, I don't know. I never had a lesson.
No.
And he just did it.
No, it's true. But he also, he had to be trained and so forth. He was in the, whatever there was, the sort of Air Force. And so they didn't let him just go up without anything. But, okay, I think that's it. Thank you.